Their 5th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a special day. Victoria had prepared herself for this moment, not because she expected anything extraordinary, but because she had long since realized that happiness had to be created by oneself. In a small jewelry store, she had noticed a sapphire pendant. Elegant but not too expensive. A symbol of a new chapter. She decided this would be her gift from Daniel. Just a hint, and he would understand. After all, he was her husband, wasn't he? When Victoria sat across from him at dinner, set in the dim light of their home in Denver, she felt at peace. A glass of red wine, candles, a perfectly cooked steak. It all seemed ideal. But deep down, she knew. Something had changed. Daniel was focused on his phone, checking messages. "Today is a special day," Victoria said softly. He lifted his eyes to her, as if suddenly remembering she was there. "Yeah, of course. 5 years." He paused and forced a smile. "I had planned dinner at a restaurant, but something urgent came up, so let's just stay home." She forced herself to smile back. "That's fine," she said. "But I have one request." He frowned slightly, as if already expecting something unpleasant. "What kind of gift would you like to receive?" she continued. "Because I know what I want." Daniel put his phone down and sighed, as if she had just put him in a difficult position. "Vic, isn't what we have enough?" His voice grew firmer. "Didn't we agree that stability was the most important thing? Wasn't that what our life was about?" Victoria recognized that tone. A couple of years ago, he had used it when convincing her not to take a new job, when persuading her to move into a bigger house even though she wanted to stay in their downtown apartment. It was the tone of a man who believed he was always right. "It's just a pendant, Dan. Not a car, not a house. I thought it would be nice. A symbol." "A symbol of what? That you still expect me to spoil you like in the early years?" He leaned back in his chair, looking at her with irritation. "Honestly, Victoria, when did you become so materialistic?" Before she could respond, their son, Oliver, interrupted. He was sitting at the kitchen table, thoughtfully studying his tablet. His voice was unexpectedly cold. "Mom, you should learn from Miss Lauren," he said. "She's not like you. Greedy. She's just kind." Victoria froze. Miss Lauren. A name that had been appearing in their home more and more often. Daniel looked away. He knew she understood. "Oliver, don't talk to your mother like that," he muttered. But Oliver didn't stop. "If I could, I'd want Miss Lauren to be my mom," he added with the innocent cruelty of a child. Victoria slowly set her wine glass down, making sure not to grip it too tightly and let it slip from her fingers. A heavy silence filled the room. For the first time in a long time, she didn't want to fight. She didn't want to prove that she deserved to be there. She looked up, met her son's gaze, then Daniel's, and exhaled. "Then let Lauren be your mother." Daniel rubbed his forehead nervously. "Victoria, don't say things like that." But Oliver was already beaming. His eyes were bright with excitement. "Dad," Mom agreed. "When is Miss Lauren moving in?" Something inside her broke. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floor with a dull sound. She walked silently toward the bedroom, feeling the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She knew this was the end. Daniel followed, his hands resting on her shoulders. The scent of his cologne, once comforting, now made her sick. It was tainted with another woman's perfume. "Vic, Oliver is just a kid. He doesn't understand what he's saying. We can..." She pulled away from his touch. "Let's get a divorce, Daniel." Her husband's eyes darkened with frustration. "All this over a pendant?" He scoffed. She wanted to tell him it wasn't about the pendant, that he hadn't given her a gift in 5 years, that he had erased her from his life. But suddenly, she realized she was too tired to explain. "Yes," she said calmly. He stared at her for a moment, then grabbed the divorce papers from the table. He signed them quickly, barely hesitating. "Was everything I gave you not enough?" His voice turned cold. "You're abandoning us?" She looked at him one last time. "No, Daniel. You abandoned us first." Behind her, she heard a shuffle. Oliver stood in the doorway. His eyes gleamed with triumph. "Are you really leaving, Mom? Then Dad and I can be with Miss Lauren." Her heart shattered, but the pain was so familiar it felt almost light. She walked to the table, picked up a thick notebook where she had written down all of Oliver's allergies, and handed it to him. "This is for you," she said. He frowned. "I don't want to remember all this. Miss Lauren will take care of me." Victoria nodded. "Then everything is settled." She grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. No one stopped her. Not her husband. Not her son. As she stepped outside, she heard Oliver's cheerful voice behind her. "Finally, now Miss Lauren will be my mom." She hesitated for a second, but her feet kept moving. Outside, the evening air of Denver was growing colder, the city lights flickering in the distance. Victoria understood that tonight, her life would start over. Victoria didn't cry when she left the house. She didn't look back. The tears came later, in solitude, but not in front of them. Not in front of the husband who didn't try to stop her. Not in front of the son who was happy to see her go. It was over, and in that realization, there was a strange clarity. Her new apartment smelled of emptiness. A simple one-room studio in Denver, an old carpet, peeling walls, a tiny kitchen. But it was her space. No traces of Daniel, no sounds reminding her of the past. Here, she could breathe. The first day after leaving, she spent in silence. Staring out the window, watching the city lights flicker at night, she tried to grasp the fact that she no longer had a husband, no longer had a big house, not even a son. He had chosen someone else. Victoria knew that at one point, this realization would have shattered her. But now? Now there was only emptiness inside. The divorce process moved quickly. Daniel didn't resist. On the contrary, he looked relieved. He signed the papers at their first meeting with the lawyer without asking a single question. "Are you sure you want to leave it all behind like this?" the lawyer asked, glancing at the documents. "The house, the assets." "Let him keep them," Victoria said without hesitation. She didn't want to share walls or possessions with Daniel. She wanted him to live in his world, and she would live in hers. After the signing, they met at the exit of the lawyer's office. Daniel looked relaxed, as if nothing had happened. "Well, congratulations," he smirked. "Now you have a fresh start." Victoria studied him carefully. He wasn't upset. He didn't look lost. On the contrary, something like relief shone in his eyes. "Yes," she nodded slowly. "A fresh start. By the way, Oliver is happy. He's getting used to Lauren. She's good to him. They get along. So, everything worked out, right?" She felt something tighten inside, but her face remained emotionless. "Everything worked out," she repeated. Daniel smiled, shrugged, and walked to his car. Victoria watched as he drove away and then took a deep breath. This was the end. Officially. But something inside her didn't sit right. She couldn't figure out what exactly. Maybe it was the fact that she had expected some kind of reaction, even a hint of regret. Just one question, one moment of doubt. But there was nothing. And then the rumors started. The first news came a few weeks later. An old neighbor posted online. "Daniel doesn't come home at night anymore. Lauren leaves a lot. Something weird is going on." Victoria ignored it. Not her problem. But then, her former friend Rachel sent a message. "I didn't want to interfere, but Daniel seems different. Oliver too. Are you sure everything is okay?" She didn't reply. She just stared at the screen until the words blurred. She wasn't supposed to care about what happened in that house anymore. But she did. She tried to convince herself it wasn't her concern. That her life was here now, in her little apartment, in her new world, where there was no room for Daniel. But the thoughts kept returning, again and again. How was Oliver living? Was he really happy? Or had it been a child's illusion that was now turning against him? A few days after receiving the message, she went out to buy groceries but stopped at the door when she saw a familiar figure. Daniel stood on the corner of the street. He didn't see her. He looked different. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He had lost that polished look of a successful businessman who took pride in his appearance. His eyes were tense. He looked like something was falling apart. Victoria watched him for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. This was no longer her concern, but deep inside, a strange premonition settled. Something told her the real problems were only beginning. If you're eager to find out how this story ends, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. And if you're already invested in the characters, show your support with a like. After the divorce, Victoria expected to feel relief, but instead, there was only emptiness. The days blurred into one endless stream of routine: work, grocery shopping, attempts to fill the silence with music or the background noise of the news. But at the end of each day, she returned to an empty apartment where there was no laughter, no voices. She didn't miss Daniel, no, but Oliver. No matter how hard she tried to shut it out, thoughts of him kept creeping back. He had chosen Lauren, chosen a life without her, but was he truly happy? Rumors continued to spread. A month after the divorce, her neighbor Susan, a woman in her 60s, stopped her at the entrance to the building. "Victoria, dear, I don't mean to pry, but did you hear that Daniel fired half of his employees?" Victoria tensed. Number Susan sighed. "Something's not right with him. They say his business is falling apart. And Lauren." She trailed off, but Victoria understood what she meant. Lauren wasn't the type of woman to stay when a man started losing his status. Victoria nodded, mumbled a polite thank you, and walked away. She wasn't supposed to think about this. It wasn't her life anymore. But a few days later, something even more unexpected happened. As she was coming home from work, she saw a little girl sitting on the steps of her building. She looked about 8 or 9, wearing worn-out clothes, her hair unkempt. Victoria slowed her steps. "Are you waiting for someone?" The girl looked up at her with frightened eyes. "Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. Something about her struck Victoria. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, far too grown up for such a small face. Maybe it was the way she sat, as if she were used to being invisible. "Did someone hurt you?" The girl shook her head. Victoria hesitated, but then sighed. "Are you hungry?" The girl nodded so quickly that there was no doubt. She hadn't eaten in a while. They went up to Victoria's apartment. She set a plate of sandwiches and a cup of hot tea in front of her guest. The girl ate as if she hadn't had a meal in days. "What's your name?" "Emily." "Where are your parents, Emily?" She didn't lift her eyes. "I lived with my stepmother, but she said she didn't need me anymore." Victoria felt something tighten inside her. "Do you have any other family?" Emily shook her head. Victoria watched her for a few moments before quietly saying, "You can stay here at least until we figure something out." Emily finally looked up at her, for the first time all evening. Victoria knew she was making a mistake. This wasn't her responsibility. She barely had the strength to deal with her own life. But in this child's eyes, she saw something she couldn't ignore. She didn't need to save Daniel. She didn't need to save Oliver. But maybe, just maybe, she could save this one child. Victoria didn't know what exactly had pushed her to let Emily stay. Maybe it was her eyes, fearful, yet still full of hope. Maybe it was the strange feeling that if she closed the door on her, she would never forgive herself. In any case, she didn't turn the girl away. Time passed, and Emily gradually became a part of her life. She was quiet, cautious, but slowly got used to the home. Victoria bought her a few things, arranged temporary guardianship. It was surprisingly easy. It seemed no one cared that the girl had disappeared. Over time, Emily started to open up. Sometimes Victoria caught her looking at her with gratitude. Sometimes at night, she heard quiet sobs, but she didn't interfere. She gave her time. But the calmer her new life became, the more often the past reminded her of itself. One evening, as Victoria was putting Emily to bed, there was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she saw someone she hadn't seen in months. Oliver. He had grown. It felt like years had passed instead of just months. The joy in his eyes was gone. Instead, he looked tired and lost. "Mom," he said quietly. Victoria remained silent. She had waited for this moment, but now she didn't know what to say. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, letting him in. Emily peeked out from the bedroom, her big eyes studying the unfamiliar boy. "Who is that?" Oliver frowned. "Emily, go to your room," Victoria said. The girl nodded and disappeared behind the door. Oliver looked around. "You have a new family now?" There was bitterness in his voice. "I could ask you the same thing," Victoria replied calmly. He sighed heavily and sat on the couch. "Dad is gone." She blinked. "What do you mean, gone?" "He just disappeared. He hasn't come home for days. I don't know what to do. Lauren said it's not her problem and that I should figure it out myself." Victoria felt a chill inside. She wasn't surprised, but hearing it from her own son was painful. "Why did you come to me?" Oliver didn't answer immediately. Then he looked up and quietly said, "Because you always took care of me." The words hit her hard. Just months ago, this boy had gladly rejected her for Lauren, and now he was here because he realized his perfect family wasn't so perfect after all. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she nodded. "All right. Tomorrow we'll try to find your father." Oliver nodded, but he didn't look satisfied. He seemed to be waiting for something more. "Mom, do you hate me?" Victoria looked at him. This wasn't the boy who had laughed when she left. This was a child who, perhaps for the first time, realized what he had lost. "No, Oliver," she said, "but I'm not the person who will always save you when you make mistakes." He looked away as if trying to process that. Victoria stood up. "You can stay the night. The guest room is free. Tomorrow we'll deal with your father." Oliver nodded but said nothing. Victoria went to her room, feeling a heavy weight on her heart. It seemed that the past wasn't going to let her go so easily. The morning after Oliver arrived, Victoria felt an unusual sense of tension settle in her chest. She hadn't woken up to the sound of a child moving through her home in years, at least not her own child. Emily was always quiet in the mornings, never making a sound before Victoria got up, but today she heard footsteps pacing back and forth in the living room. Oliver was awake. She sighed, pulled on a sweater, and stepped into the living room. Oliver sat at the table, staring at his untouched cup of tea, his fingers drumming restlessly against the surface. He looked up when she entered. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. Victoria sat across from him. "You've never had trouble sleeping before." He exhaled sharply. "Because I never had to worry about where my dad was." She stayed silent, waiting. "He was always in control, you know?" Oliver continued, his voice raw with uncertainty. "Even when he was busy, I always knew he'd be there. But now, I don't know. He's just gone." Victoria studied him carefully. This was a different Oliver from the boy who had once dismissed her, who had told her he didn't need her. Now, he looked lost. She wanted to tell him that this was what happened when people built their lives on illusions, but she bit her tongue. He was still just a child. "We'll find him," she said simply. "Eat something first." Oliver gave her a half-hearted nod but didn't touch his food. Victoria turned toward the hallway and found Emily peeking from the doorway, watching them with cautious eyes. "Come eat, Emily," she called gently. The girl hesitated, then walked over, sliding into a chair beside Victoria. She shot a wary glance at Oliver, but he barely acknowledged her. The drive to Daniel's house was tense. Oliver sat in the passenger seat, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the window as though afraid to see what waited for them. When they pulled up to the familiar driveway, Victoria's stomach clenched. The house looked unchanged from the outside, but there was an eerie stillness around it. The curtains were drawn, the lawn unkempt. Something felt off. Oliver hesitated before stepping out, but Victoria didn't. She walked straight to the front door and knocked firmly. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. A flicker of worry crept up her spine. She turned the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The air inside was heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of alcohol and neglect. Empty bottles littered the coffee table, and papers were strewn across the floor. The house, which once stood pristine under Daniel's obsessive care, now looked like a ruin. Oliver hesitated in the doorway, his expression darkening. "Dad?" A groan from the hallway. Victoria moved instinctively, following the sound. She found Daniel slumped on the couch, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. He looked up at her through bleary eyes, confusion flickering across his face before recognition settled in. "Victoria?" he croaked. She crossed her arms. "What the hell happened to you?" Daniel rubbed his temples. "It's not what it looks like." Oliver stormed in behind her, his face filled with anger. "Where the hell have you been?" Daniel looked at his son and let out a shaky breath. "I messed up." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. This was a man who once prided himself on never losing control, who had built his life around the image of power and stability. And now, he was nothing but a shadow. "You think?" Oliver's voice cracked. "You just disappeared, Dad. Lauren left. She doesn't care. And you didn't even tell me anything. You left me alone." Daniel buried his face in his hands. "I thought I had everything figured out," he murmured. "I really did." Victoria watched him carefully. She had seen men break before, but she never expected Daniel to be one of them. Oliver clenched his fists. "So what now? Are you just giving up?" Daniel exhaled heavily and looked up at Victoria. "What do I do?" The fact that he was asking her, that he even thought she could save him, sent a bitter surge through her chest. "You do what you should have done a long time ago," she said coldly. "You pick yourself up, and you fix this mess." Daniel stared at her, and for a moment, she saw something shift in his gaze. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was understanding. Either way, it was too late for her to care. Oliver turned away first. "Come on, Mom, let's go." Victoria hesitated for only a second before following her son out the door. She didn't look back. Not this time. Did this story touch your heart? Show your support by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing what stood out to you the most in the comments. We love hearing from you. Returning home after seeing Daniel left a heavy weight on Victoria's heart. Oliver sat next to her in the car, staring silently out the window. He hadn't said a word since they left his father's house, and Victoria didn't push him to talk. Each of them was processing what they had seen in their own way. When they returned to the apartment, Emily was there, peeking cautiously around the corner. "Did you find him?" she asked quietly. Oliver shot her a quick glance but remained silent. Victoria only nodded. "Yes, we found him." She sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples. Her thoughts were spinning, but the loudest one was, "What now? He's in terrible shape, isn't he?" Oliver's voice broke the silence. He stood by the door as if unsure whether to step further into the apartment. "Yes," Victoria admitted honestly. "What are you going to do?" He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, pain, and fear. She was quiet for a long time before she calmly replied, "Nothing." Oliver flinched. "What do you mean, nothing? He won't make it on his own." "And did you?" Victoria looked at him directly. "When you chose Lauren over me, when you said she was better, did you make it?" Oliver froze. His face paled, but he didn't look away. "I was a child," he whispered. "You're still a child, Oliver. But that doesn't change the fact that I can't save your father. I won't make myself his priority again." He put himself in this situation. Oliver clenched his fists as if wanting to argue, but then suddenly turned and stormed into another room. Victoria let him go. Emily sat beside her, gently tugging on her sleeve. "Are you really not going to help him?" Her voice was filled with concern. Victoria looked at her and smiled softly. Emily, sometimes helping someone isn't about giving them what they want. It's about letting them go through what they need to. The girl didn't fully understand, but she nodded. The next few days were tense. Oliver barely left his room, only appearing for meals. Victoria didn't pressure him. He needed to figure things out on his own. And then, a week later, he disappeared. When Victoria woke up, his things were still there, but he was gone. His phone went unanswered. She had a gut feeling. This wasn't just a walk. He had gone where he thought he was needed. To Daniel, did this story touch your heart? Show your support by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing what stood out to you the most in the comments. We love hearing from you. The days that followed Daniel's collapse were quieter than Victoria had anticipated. There were no desperate calls from him, no sudden attempts to win her back into the chaos of his life. It was as if he had finally accepted what she had known for a long time. There was no going back. Oliver, however, was different. He was quieter, more reserved. And although he never brought up that night at his father's house again, she could tell it still lingered in his thoughts. He spent more time at home, sitting with Emily, sometimes even helping her with schoolwork. It was a sight Victoria never thought she'd see, a bond forming between two children who had been left behind in different ways. One evening, while she was making tea, Oliver finally spoke. "I don't know how to stop thinking about him." Victoria turned to him. "You don't have to stop thinking about him. You just have to stop trying to fix what isn't yours to fix." Oliver exhaled heavily. He was supposed to be strong. He was supposed to be the one holding everything together. She set down the kettle and leaned against the counter. Sometimes, the people who seem the strongest are the ones who break the hardest. For a long moment, Oliver said nothing. Then he nodded. A week later, Victoria received an unexpected call. "Ms. Lawson, this is Dr. Ramirez from Denver General Hospital. I believe you're listed as Daniel Lawson's emergency contact." Her breath caught. "What happened?" "He was admitted last night. Alcohol poisoning. He's stable now, but he has no one here. He refused treatment initially, but he asked for you." Victoria closed her eyes. She had known this was coming, hadn't she? That Daniel wouldn't change unless he hit rock bottom. And yet, hearing it out loud still sent a cold wave through her. She could say no. She could refuse to go. Let him lie in that hospital bed alone, just as he had left her alone for years. But something inside her, perhaps the part of her that had once loved him, told her she needed to see this for herself. When she arrived, Daniel was awake, but looked like a ghost of himself. His eyes, hollow and bloodshot, met hers, and for the first time, she saw not arrogance or defiance, but something closer to surrender. "I knew you'd come," he murmured. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat in the chair beside him, taking in the sight of the man who had once built an empire and now lay in a sterile hospital bed, broken. "Why did you ask for me?" she finally said. Daniel sighed. "Because you're the only person who ever told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it." Victoria studied him, trying to find traces of the man she once knew. "And what do you want to hear now?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "That I'm not a lost cause, that it's not too late." She folded her arms. "Is it?" He stared at the ceiling. "I don't know, but I want to try." For a moment, Victoria felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. But she had learned not to give it too easily. Not when it came to Daniel. "Then it has to be your choice," she said firmly. "Not for me. Not for Oliver. Not for your business. For you." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he truly understood that for the first time. When she left the hospital that evening, she didn't feel lighter or relieved, but she did feel done. She had given him the truth one last time. The rest was up to him. At home, Oliver was waiting. He looked at her expectantly, but she only said, "He's alive, but whether he stays that way is up to him." Oliver didn't press further. Instead, he reached for Emily, who who curled up next to him on the couch. Victoria watched them, realizing that despite everything, something new had formed here. A real family. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Months had passed since Victoria last saw Daniel. He hadn't called, hadn't tried to reach out, and this time, she wasn't waiting. He had made his choice, and his fate was no longer her concern. She had finally allowed herself to live. Victoria's life slowly found a new rhythm. She no longer looked back, no longer dwelled on lost years or guilt. Her days were filled with work, taking care of the house, and being present for those who truly mattered. Oliver had changed. He was no longer the arrogant teenager who had pushed her away for illusions. He wasn't just staying in Victoria's house. He had become a part of it. He spent time with Emily, read books, helped with chores. Sometimes, Victoria caught him looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before: gratitude. One evening, as Victoria sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Oliver stepped outside and sat next to her. "Mom," he said suddenly. She turned to him, slightly surprised. He rarely called her that since returning. "Thank you for not pushing me away. After everything I did, I didn't deserve it." Victoria smiled, looking at him with warmth, and simply said, "You are my son." Her words needed no explanation. It wasn't about the past. It was about what was now. One morning, Victoria received a letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting instantly familiar. "Victoria, I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I have no one left to blame but myself. You were right. You always were. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I'm not running anymore. I've checked into rehab. Maybe it won't change anything, but I need to try. If Oliver wants to see me, I'd be happy. If not, I understand. Daniel." She read the letter several times but felt no pain, no regret, only peace. This was no longer her battle. That evening, when Oliver returned home, she handed him the letter. He read it silently, then stared at the paper as if weighing his emotions. "What do you think?" Victoria asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe one day, I'll want to see him." "Then you'll decide when that time comes," Victoria said softly. Oliver nodded, folded the letter, and slipped it into his pocket. Life went on. Emily had started calling Victoria Mom, and there was no fear or hesitation in her voice. Victoria accepted it as naturally as she had accepted Oliver. They were a family now, a real one despite the scars of the past. One morning, Victoria stepped outside, breathed in the fresh air, and smiled. For the first time in years, she felt free. Her past no longer defined her. It was merely the road that had led her here. Now, she could move forward. Thank you for listening to this story on our YouTube channel Life Stories. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more real-life inspired stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new episodes. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the characters made the right decisions? What would you have done in their place? We value your opinion. Your support helps us create more engaging content, so don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for new stories. See you in the next episode.